The low thrum of the environmental controls was the only constant companion in Blake's section of the research station. It was a sterile, hushed sound, like a mechanical heart beating beneath layers of concrete and steel. Fluorescent lights, shielded by frosted panels, cast an even, shadowless glare across the rows of archival shelving, illuminating dust motes dancing in the inert air. Blake, an archivist of formidable precision, thrived in this controlled stillness. Their life was a meticulous sequence of cataloging, cross-referencing, and preserving, a quiet battle against the entropy of information. Today's task involved a newly delivered collection from Sublevel 7, a section of the station that had been sealed for decades, its contents largely forgotten. The collection arrived in sturdy, unmarked crates, smelling faintly of ozone and something metallic, a scent that clung to the air even after the crates were opened. Blake donned fresh nitrile gloves, the material squeaking faintly as their fingers flexed. Each item would be logged, cleaned, scanned, and assigned a permanent digital and physical identifier. It was a process Blake had refined over years, a comforting ritual of order. The first crate yielded standard-issue research logs, brittle with age, their pages filled with precise, hand-drawn diagrams of geological strata. The second contained a series of recording devices, obsolete but intact, their magnetic tapes awaiting delicate transfer. Blake worked with steady, deliberate movements, their mind a database of classification codes and preservation techniques. The work was absorbing, demanding a focus that left little room for extraneous thought. Then came the third crate. It was smaller than the others, heavier than its dimensions suggested, and sealed with an unfamiliar lead-based solder. Blake noted the discrepancy. All Sublevel 7 containers were supposed to be standard aluminum alloy, secured with a specific magnetic lock. This one bore no visible markings, no inventory number, no date. It was an anomaly, a tiny ripple in the perfectly calm waters of Blake's ordered universe. A flicker of unease, sharp and unexpected, pricked at Blake's composure. They pushed it aside. Anomalies were merely puzzles to be solved, not omens. With a specialized soldering iron, Blake carefully melted the lead seal, the faint acrid smoke stinging their nostrils. The lid lifted with a soft sigh of displaced air. Inside, nestled in a bed of desiccated packing material, lay not a document or a device, but an object. It was roughly cubic, about the size of Blake's fist, and crafted from a dull, obsidian-like material that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light rather than reflect it. Its surface was smooth, unblemished, yet it possessed an unsettling texture, as if its facets were subtly out of alignment. There were no seams, no join lines, no apparent method of construction. It simply was. Blake reached for it, their gloved fingers hesitating inches above its surface. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the air, a vibration that resonated not in the floor or the shelving, but deep within Blake's own bones. It was a sensation akin to standing too close to a high-voltage transformer, a low-frequency hum that bypassed the ears entirely. The object felt cold. This was the reveal. This was the discovery. Blake carefully lifted the object. It was denser than any known substance of its size, a dead weight in their palm. As their fingers closed around it, the subtle tremor intensified, becoming a persistent, internal thrum. A strange visual distortion shimmered at the periphery of their vision, a brief warping of the sterile walls, as if the air itself had momentarily rippled. Blake blinked, the distortion vanished, leaving only the unwavering lines of the archive. Had they imagined it? The question was alien to Blake, whose observations were always precise, always verifiable. They had never doubted their own perceptions before. The object itself offered no clues. No inscriptions, no moving parts, no discernible function. It was simply a perfect, impossible cube of nothingness. Blake placed it gently onto the scanning bed. The usual array of sensors, designed to identify material composition and structural integrity, flickered uncertainly. The readouts were gibberish: negative mass, impossible density, a spectral analysis that returned only null values. It was as if the object actively defied measurement, existing in a blind spot of scientific understanding. This was not merely an anomaly, it was a fundamental contradiction. The research station, built on the bedrock of empirical data, had just yielded something that negated every principle it stood upon. Blake felt a growing pressure behind their eyes, a subtle ache that resonated with the internal hum from the object. They looked at the empty crate, then back at the impossible cube. No inventory. No record. It was as if it had simply appeared. Blake's breath hitched. They reached for the digital logbook, their fingers hovering over the entry field. What would they even write? The very act of classification, their life's work, seemed to shrivel in the face of this silent, inert object. The hum intensified, a silent, insistent whisper at the edge of comprehension. Blake knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that their world had just shifted, irrevocably. Blake, however, felt no comfort in the familiar hum, nor in the predictable glow. Their focus had narrowed to the object resting on the reinforced examination table, the artifact. It was an irregular polyhedron, roughly the size of a human skull, its surface a dull, obsidian-like material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. There were no seams, no visible points of manufacture. Its facets were not geometrically precise, but subtly, unsettlingly asymmetrical, as if carved by a hand that understood a different kind of symmetry. Blake's gloved fingers traced a shallow, almost imperceptible ridge that ran across one of its larger faces. It felt cold, unnaturally so, even through the synthetic fabric. There was no inscription, no symbol, no indication of purpose or origin within the station's extensive, if compartmentalized, database. It simply was. Driven by a meticulous determination, Blake initiated the first phase of direct analysis. They secured a high-resolution optical scanner, its articulated arm extending with a software, bathing the artifact in a gentle, pulsing beam. The data streamed onto Blake's primary display, complex topological maps, material composition readouts that defied known elements, and a faint, persistent energy signature that registered as a low-frequency oscillation. It wasn't radioactive, nor electromagnetic in any standard sense. It was something else, an internal vibration that seemed to resonate just beneath the threshold of hearing, a sensation Blake felt more in their bones than their ears. Blake leaned closer to the monitor, ignoring the growing discomfort in their neck. "Anomalous signature," they murmured, their voice a low rasp in the quiet space. It was as if the artifact existed in a different set of physical laws, only partially intersecting with their own. This wasn't merely unknown, it was fundamentally unaccounted for. They moved from direct analysis to contextual research. The station's archives, a sprawling digital labyrinth of classified and unclassified documents, became Blake's next battleground. They cross-referenced every anomalous material report, every archaeological find, every obscure historical record of strange phenomena. Hours bled into days. The fluorescent light seemed to dim imperceptibly, the hum of the environmental controls to deepen. Blake consumed countless pages of data, their eyes burning from the screen's relentless glow. They searched for anything that might hint at the artifact's provenance, its purpose, its very existence. The first disturbing connection emerged not from a direct hit, but from a series of near misses. Disparate records, a 17th-century cartographer's cryptic marginalia, a peculiar geological survey from the 1920s detailing impossible rock formations, an obscure transcription of an oral tradition from an isolated community, all contained oblique references to shapes, textures, or a specific, non-Euclidean geometry that mirrored the artifact's subtle asymmetry. Each mention was fleeting, dismissed as folklore or misinterpretation in its original context, but together, they formed a loose, unsettling constellation. This wasn't coincidence. This was too specific, too consistent across vastly different cultures and eras. They pulled up the cartographer's map again, zooming in on the small, hand-drawn symbol in the corner. It was a crude sketch, but the underlying geometry was undeniable. Then, the geological survey. A photograph of a rock face, weathered by millennia, revealed a similar, faint pattern of ridges. The oral tradition spoke of stones that sang a silent song, and Blake could almost feel the artifact's slow oscillation intensifying. A new wave of unease washed over Blake. They rubbed their temples, feeling the dull ache of prolonged concentration. Was their mind drawing connections where none existed? The isolation of their section, the relentless quiet, the pressure of the task, it could all be contributing to a heightened sense of pattern recognition, a hallucination of meaning. They knew the risks of confirmation bias, the human tendency to see what one expects to see. But the evidence, however fragmented, felt too concrete, too insistent. Determined to dispel the creeping self-doubt, Blake pressed on, seeking a definitive link. They refined their search parameters, focusing on the unique energy signature the scanner had detected. The station's archive system, usually a paragon of efficiency, seemed to hesitate, its search algorithms struggling with the abstract nature of the query. Then, a single, unexpected result materialized, a corrupted data file, flagged for deletion decades ago, marked Project CHRONOS, Anomaly 7. The file itself was largely unreadable, a jumble of encrypted characters, but a single, uncorrupted image thumbnail remained. Blake clicked the thumbnail. The image resolved on the screen, monochrome and grainy, but unmistakably clear. It was a photograph, taken in a dimly lit chamber, of a table much like their own. And upon that table, bathed in an eerie, undefined light, rested an object identical to the artifact before them. It was the exact same object. The file was dated almost a century prior. There was no record of this Project CHRONOS in any accessible part of the archive. No mention of Anomaly 7. It was as if this entire project, this entire discovery, had been systematically purged, scrubbed from history. And yet, here it was, in Blake's hands, on their table, humming its silent, impossible song. This artifact was not merely unknown, it was forgotten, actively suppressed. And if it had been forgotten, why had it resurfaced now? And what had happened to those who had encountered it before? The low thrum of the station no longer felt like a constant companion, it felt like the distant, rhythmic beat of a pulse that was not their own. Blake, however, was no longer comforted by the predictable rhythm or the uniform illumination. The artifact rested on a reinforced examination table, its obsidian-like surface absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Its facets, once appearing static, now seemed to possess a subtle, internal tremor that only Blake's peripheral vision could catch. Blake's determination had solidified into a cold, sharp point. Sleep had become a fleeting, unwelcome guest, chased away by the persistent itch of unanswered questions. They spent hours hunched over the terminal, cross-referencing ancient linguistic fragments with the artifact's intricate carvings. The data, once a disjointed collection of historical curiosities, began to coalesce. A pattern emerged, not in the symbols themselves, but in their absence. Gaps in the historical record, once dismissed as accidental omissions, now appeared deliberate. Almost surgical. A jolt ran through Blake as a particularly obscure text from a forgotten culture, catalogued as ritualistic nonsense, seemed to describe the artifact's geometric complexity with uncanny precision. The text spoke of a lens for the unseen, a gateway to the true form. It wasn't a physical gateway, the words implied, but a perceptual one. The artifact didn't transport anything, it revealed. As Blake processed this, the environmental hum, usually a steady drone, began to waver. It was a subtle shift, a barely perceptible flattening of its frequency, followed by a sudden, sharp harmonic that seemed to resonate directly behind Blake's eardrums. They flinched, glancing up. The fluorescent panels above flickered, not in a conventional, failing bulb manner, but as if the light itself was momentarily starved, then overfed. Blake rubbed their eyes, convinced it was fatigue. Just tired, they muttered, the sound swallowed by the vast, quiet space. But the anomaly persisted. Blake stared at the reflection, then at their hand, flexing it, trying to confirm its solidity. The hand in the reflection mimicked the motion, but the fingers appeared unnaturally long, slender, almost skeletal. Blake snatched their hand away. This was not just tired eyes or a faulty reflection. This was a direct assault on their perception. Yet, the determination held. They pushed the terminal closer, the faint hum of its cooling fan a counterpoint to the growing unease. The ancient text spoke of the breaking of the veil, of the mind made permeable. Blake's breath hitched. As Blake focused, the facets of the object shifted. A low, guttural sound, like stones grinding together beneath immense pressure, began to emanate from the artifact. It wasn't a sound that vibrated the air, it vibrated Blake's bones, their teeth, the very fluid in their inner ear. They clamped their hands over their ears, but the sound was internal, a resonance within their own skull. Then, it happened. The wall directly opposite Blake, a seamless expanse of reinforced concrete, began to shimmer. It wasn't a mirage, nor a trick of the light. The concrete itself seemed to thin, to stretch, to become translucent. Behind it, not the sterile conduits and wiring Blake knew to be there, but something else. A vastness. A swirling, impossible vortex of colors that defied the known spectrum, hues that made Blake's eyes ache with their wrongness. They were not solid, not defined, but suggestions of form, shifting, folding in on themselves, like impossible geometry being drawn and redrawn in an instant. They seemed to possess too many angles, too many dimensions for Blake's mind to process. A silent scream caught in Blake's throat. Their reality was tearing. The sterile, predictable research station, their anchor, was dissolving before their eyes. The shapes behind the translucent wall were not alien in the conventional sense, they were fundamental. They were the raw, unfiltered components of existence, revealed in a state of chaotic, terrifying flux. It wasn't just a lens, it was a breach. It was something that had always been here, woven into the very fabric of reality, simply waiting for a perception to be opened, for a mind to be shattered enough to truly see it. The artifact was not bringing a monster, it was showing the monster that was already everything. The wall snapped back to its solid, gray uniformity, the impossible colors and forms vanishing as if they had never been. The guttural sound faded, replaced by the persistent, if slightly off-kilter, hum of the environmental controls. But Blake's perception remained irrevocably altered. And Blake, the archivist, was now truly awake. Blake sat before a terminal, the screens displaying complex, interwoven data streams extracted from the artifact. Determination, a brittle shell around the core of escalating dread, still propelled Blake forward. He had spent the last cycle meticulously cross-referencing the artifact's resonant frequencies with historical seismic data, ancient cosmological texts, and obscure linguistic patterns. The connections were tenuous at first, then unsettlingly coherent, like disparate threads suddenly weaving into a grotesque tapestry. The artifact, a polished, obsidian-like sphere, rested on a specialized sensor platform nearby, its surface occasionally rippling with an imperceptible internal energy that made the surrounding air feel thick and viscous. Blake found his gaze drifting to it more often, a magnetic pull drawing his focus from the data. A low, buzzing whine began to emanate from the terminal speakers, a sound that started beneath the range of human hearing and slowly ascended, a rising tide of sonic pressure. It was not part of the research station's systems, it was new, intrusive. Blake pressed his temples, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. The fluorescent lights above flickered, not in sequence, but individually, like dying stars winking out one by one across a vast, artificial sky. He blinked, hard, but the distortions persisted, growing bolder. The polished concrete floor seemed to undulate, the straight lines of the archival shelving bending and swaying. His fingers, still poised over the keyboard, felt alien, detached. He looked down at them, watching the subtle tremor, and saw them not as his own, but as instruments controlled by an unseen, external force. The buzzing intensified, now a high-pitched scream that resonated not just in his ears, but deep within his bone structure. He could feel it vibrating in his teeth. The screen before him blurred, the precise alphanumeric characters dissolving into shimmering glyphs that pulsed with an internal, malevolent light. This was not a malfunction. This was a revelation. The artifact, he realized, wasn't just showing him data. It was rewriting his perception of reality itself. The seismic patterns weren't just records of earth tremors, they were the rhythmic contractions of something vast, something beneath. The cosmological texts weren't myths, they were fragmented eyewitness accounts of a truth so profound it shattered the minds of its observers. The linguistic patterns weren't just ancient speech, they were the echoes of a universal language, a primal scream of existence. Blake pushed back from the terminal, the chair scraping loudly on the concrete, a sound that seemed to stretch into an impossible duration. The walls of the research station, once solid and reassuring, now appeared to breathe. The steel girders supporting the ceiling seemed to flex and groan, not with structural strain, but with an organic, internal pressure. He could perceive the space around him not as a fixed volume, but as a temporary arrangement of shifting probabilities. The very air tasted of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like rust from a forgotten universe. A colleague, a project manager with a perpetually harried expression, approached his section. "Blake? Are you seeing this data anomaly? The system diagnostics are redlining across the board. The colleague's voice was a discordant chime, each syllable resonating at a different frequency, blurring into an incomprehensible cacophony. Blake looked at the project manager, but their face was a shifting canvas of impossible angles, their features reconfiguring with each passing moment, eyes sliding out of alignment, mouth stretching into a silent, gaping maw, skin rippling like disturbed water. The project manager's lab coat, once crisp white, now seemed to ripple with impossible hues, like oil on water, reflecting light from sources that did not exist. Anomaly? Blake managed to utter, the word feeling alien on his tongue, a foreign object he struggled to articulate. His own voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger, a deep, resonant rumble from an unfamiliar chest. It's always been here. The project manager's distorted face twisted further, into what Blake interpreted as confusion, or perhaps concern. Blake, you don't look well. Are you experiencing system overload? We can cycle you out for a rest period. Rest period. The words were meaningless. There was no rest from this. There was no out. Blake saw the environmental controls, the frosted fluorescent panels, the concrete and steel, not as a research station, but as a fragile, momentary construct. A fleeting thought, a momentary dream, superimposed upon something truly vast, truly ancient, truly indifferent. He was not in a research station. His identity, his very self, felt like a loose thread in a fabric that was rapidly unraveling, threatening to dissolve entirely into the vast, indifferent truth that pulsed just beyond the thin membrane of human perception. The environmental controls hummed, a low, consistent thrum against the concrete floor that now vibrated with a different, internal rhythm. Blake saw the frosted fluorescent panels not as sources of light, but as thin membranes stretched over an unthinkable void. The steel supports were not structural, they were sinews, holding together a fragile form that threatened to shed its skin. There was no rest. There was no out. Blake stood in the central chamber of the research station, the air thick with the metallic tang of ozone and a faint, sweet decay. The artifact, a polished obsidian cylinder resting on its reinforced plinth, no longer merely pulsed. It breathed. Blake felt its slow, expansive inhalation, a suction that pulled at the edges of their own awareness, followed by a soft, shuddering exhalation that pushed aberrant thoughts into the cranial cavity. They had pursued this truth through crumbling archives and whispered theories, through the slow erosion of their own mind. Now, the final revelation awaited. A colleague, a researcher focused on seismic data, had entered the chamber hours ago, drawn by an anomalous energy signature. Blake remembered the colleague's initial excitement, the nervous laughter, the way their eyes had widened, then narrowed, then glazed over. They stood motionless now, slumped against a console, their gaze fixed on a distant, non-existent point. Their silence was a heavy blanket, a testament to the terminal nature of direct observation. Blake felt a detached pity, but no fear for their own fate. Fear was a luxury of the uninitiated. Blake was beyond that. They were determined. Blake moved towards the artifact, each step deliberate, a conscious act of will against the rising tide of conceptual dissolution. The floor, once solid, now rippled underfoot, not physically, but as a perceived distortion in the underlying geometry. The walls of the research station seemed to stretch and contract, the familiar angles bending into impossible curves. This was not hallucination, this was understanding. The universe was not rigid. It was fluid, a viscous, churning medium disguised by the conventions of human perception. they reached the plinth. The obsidian cylinder was no longer merely a cylinder. Its surface swirled with patterns that shifted and reconfigured, reflecting light that originated from nowhere. It was a window, not to another place, but to an underlying state of being. Blake reached out, fingers trembling, not from apprehension, but from the sheer effort of maintaining physical cohesion. The air around the artifact vibrated with a low hum, a sound that bypassed the ears and resonated directly within the bone, a deep, atavistic note that felt like the universe clearing its throat. As Blake's fingertips brushed the cool, smooth surface, the final, horrifying truth unfolded. It was not a vision, not a voice, but a direct, unmediated download of pure, unadulterated reality. The universe was not empty space punctuated by matter. It was a single, vast, living entity, an organism of incomprehensible scale and antiquity. Humanity, planets, stars, galaxies, they were not distinct entities. They were cells, organelles, fleeting chemical reactions within its colossal, indifferent body. And the entity itself was not benevolent, nor malevolent. It simply was. Its existence was the true horror, not because it sought to harm, but because it rendered all human. Striving, all meaning, all individual existence utterly insignificant, a momentary flicker in an eternal, unthinking process. Blake felt themselves expand, not physically, but conceptually. Their consciousness, once a tightly bound sphere, ruptured, pouring out into the unfathomable expanse. The research station dissolved, the concrete and steel becoming mere illusions. Their body became a husk, a forgotten shell. They were no longer Blake, the archivist. They were a fragment, a fleeting thought within the colossal mind, a single, infinitesimal ripple in the cosmic bloodstream. They saw the research station as a single, calcified lesion upon the entity's skin, a brief, anomalous growth that would eventually be reabsorbed. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the facility. Lights flickered. The still figure of the colleague slumped against the console remained, untouched, unseeing. The obsidian cylinder on the plinth pulsed once more, a final, slow beat, then settled into an inert, featureless blackness. The air cleared, the metallic tang replaced by the scent of dust. No one would find Blake. There was nothing left to find. The horror had not been vanquished. It had not even acknowledged the brief, insignificant disturbance. It merely continued its silent, eternal process, the universe breathing in and out, oblivious. The research station stood, a monument to a forgotten archivist, its silent walls holding the memory of a revelation too vast for the human mind. The artifact, now dormant, waited. It always waited.